Hello, welcome to Woodworking Corner. Let's talk about sharpening then, and more specifically sharpening knives. So I've got a whole selection in front of me. Before I get stuck in, yes, I have a cut on my finger, and no, it wasn't from one of these knives. I don't know where it's from actually. It doesn't hurt, but it doesn't look too pretty either, so I've covered it up for your benefit. Anyway, back to the subject. So a whole selection of knives, and then I've got a selection of things to sharpen them with. What I want to try and do here is show you the way I sharpen knives, but also explain what's going on the geometry of the knife itself, because I think if I explain the process, then the chances are much higher that you'll be able to make what I'm saying applicable to sharpening your own knives. I tend to keep all my knives really sharp, which doesn't really help when it comes to do a demonstration on sharpening. The exception would be this Opinal, which I've only just dug out again. I've not actually, this hasn't seen the light of day for quite a few years. Got a sheet of scrap paper, and you can see it's yeah, it's not cutting. So the best it can do is rip the paper. So if I've got a knife that's this bad, I first of all have a close look at the edge and see if there's any chips or dinks in it, and there is on this one. I'll try and show that on just up there. It might look slightly serrated. So first of all, you've got to sort that out before putting an edge on it. So I'm going to go edge down on this sharpening block. So this is a 400 grit sharpening block. So this is not normal procedure, this is just because I've seen that damage there. So now it's a consistent edge along there, and it's even more blunt. Now I can use this. This little gadget is my usual sharpening system, and if you've seen any of my knife making videos, you'll see this is the end stage of if I've made a knife, or indeed when I made the cleavers and the prangs actually. So this is a box, and it has these ceramic rods in it. Now ceramic is much harder than steel, so when you put one to the other, it's the steel that's going to give way. Also in this box comes these two, which are much finer ceramic rods, which I actually never use. With these ones here, I can get a knife up to shaving sharp, and I've never felt the need to make it sharper than that. So I've set this, actually let's put it here. So you've got two options with this particular system. You can set it here in these holes here, put the rods there and there, and that's going to give me a 25-degree bevel. Or I can put them here and here, and that'll give me a 20-degree bevel. Difference is, something like a kitchen knife, you want a really fine edge. Something like this, I'm going to use for carving and sort of rougher stuff. You would want it in the 25, and it's not going to be as fine an edge, but because there's more material behind it, it's going to be somewhat more durable. It also depends on the geometry of the knife itself, how sharp you're going to be able to get it, and we'll get into that in a moment. We'll explain the process in a bit more detail, and I'm going to show you a drawing in a sec. But all I have to do here with this sharpening system is concentrate on keeping the blade vertical, and it will form the correct angle itself. What I like about this system is it's removing the absolute minimum amount possible from the blade. I'll show you another system in a minute which does the opposite. It's no longer ripping at all, it's just cutting the paper. And of course, that's what we're after. Now, not all knives are suitable for this process, and I'll try and explain this. First of all, I'll explain the geometry of this particular knife, the one that we've just been sharpening. So if I hold it up, you may or may not be able to see, but this has got a very fine bevel on it. When talking about the geometry of knives, there's the two main terms you'll come across are primary bevel and secondary bevel. On just a generic knife, that might look something like this. So you have the edges of the blade, so blade like this, and it comes towards the edge here, and then comes in again there. So this is the primary bevel, and this is the secondary bevel. Now on this particular one, on this Opinal, it actually looks more like this, all the way from the spine back here of the knife. It descends all the way towards there, and it's only the very last bit that's got that secondary bevel on it. You'll notice there what I'm doing when I'm sharpening that Opinal, I'm not going anywhere near this first part, this primary bevel. I'm just re-establishing a secondary bevel, and it's actually just a micro bevel. It's only a tiny amount going towards the point. You can get a knife that goes from the spine here all the way to an edge, and that's called a Scandi grind, and incidentally that's what this knife has here. We'll get to that in a bit. And obviously that type of knife, it wouldn't be suitable for putting through here unless that grind was actually matching this angle, which it probably wouldn't be. So these are both what you would call a flat grind, something like the axe that I just made. If you looked at the end of that, it goes like this. It only has one bevel, and it goes right to the edge, and it's curved. So this is a convex grind. And the reason for doing something like this, apart from the fact in an axe it's going to pop the wood apart, the main reason is that it's a much more durable edge. It's not going to be as sharp because you can't refine the point so much, but you can see how much material there is behind that edge, and that's going to hold it, which is what you want for something that's going to get such brittle treatment as an axe or a chopping knife. So my parangs as well would be ground and sharpened like that. The other way that you might come across is a hollow grind. So this is the two sides of the knife blade, looking at it like that, and then it comes in. This is your primary bevel in effect, and then it comes in again like that. I'm not such a fan of that. I think it's an entirely appropriate grind for some types of sword, but for a knife it's, yeah, I don't see the appeal of it really. So that's the basics of knife geometry. One other thing I want to touch on is that when you see someone like a chef in a carvery, they take their carving knife and a sharpening steel and they go with it. What they're actually doing there is just honing the knife. They're not sharpening it. And what that knife would look like, well, the idea of what's going on, you've got your knife size there, and then it comes to a point. And for a knife that's carving meat, it's a very fine point like that. So the more refined, the more acute this angle, the more likely, just in normal use, it's going to roll. So rather than chipping or anything like that, you're only cutting meat after all. Over use, the edge would go like that. It just needs this bit straightening up again, and that's what the sharpening steel does. So that's the honing. And it's the same thing as when you finish sharpening a knife, get it to a very fine point. You can drag it across some denim, which I conveniently have some denim on my leg here. And that will put the final edge on it. Like I say, you're not taking any material off, so that's not what I would call sharpening. I would call that honing the edge. So you're putting it from there back to being there, and then it's super sharp again. back to this, just to mention this again, I'm sure people will ask what it is. I can't actually remember. It's something like a box guide or something like that. It's made by a company called Lansky. Yes, clearly not a sponsored video. I've had this for about 4 years, something like that, and it's, you know, I've made a lot of knives and sharpened them with this, sharpened them all with this, and it's held up really well. So yes, I'm quite happy with that as a system. It's worked a treat. Now the other more brutal method comes in with something like this. Now this is also made by the same company. I bought this one out of curiosity because it was sold as something you would take camping, and it's actually just a version of the really cheap sharpeners that you see all over the place. So there's two V-shaped guides in here, and one is carbide and the other is ceramic. Now tungsten carbide is also much harder than steel. For instance, on this sharpener, which again is something I bought out of curiosity, this is a block of tungsten carbide here, and if I drag it down this newly sharpened edge, it'll instantly be blunt. There you go. It's lost the edge straight away. A lot of people would sharpen knives by dragging them through one of these things, so I'll do that and show you, hopefully show you what happens. Now that is just, I can feel it ripping into the knife. So it's, yeah, it's sharpish now. It's not as sharp as when I did it on that. But what we're doing with this is it's got that V block there. So the two pieces of tungsten carbide, and you're just dragging it through, and it's establishing a micro bevel again, but it's brutal. Yeah, it's got a really crude way of doing it. So the idea is you pull it through that one, and then you put it through this one, which is a set of ceramic rods, just like these rods actually. But the jump from here to here is too much. So I'm tearing into it like that. It's like using really coarse sandpaper on a piece of wood and then going straight to a really fine sandpaper with nothing in between. I'll do this a few times and see if we get a better edge to it. It's a little bit more refined. Yeah, actually that's getting towards being okay. But the reason I don't like these sharpening systems is they are brutal. If you make a habit of using this, I like to keep my knives really sharp, but if I kept my knives really sharp with one of these, the knives would get smaller and smaller quite quickly. That's the point I'm trying to get across. Now there's a myriad other ways of sharpening knives. Of course, this is the traditional way. I've got a whole box of these. These are various types of stone. In the olden days it would be a particular type of mineral stone. These ones are artificial, I think. On this one you can see that there's a coarse side and a fine side. I think that is. And this one you use with you put some oil on it and then you sharpen chisels on that. Works fine. But for sharpening knives, it's a bit tricky. So for something like this, where I don't want to, if I wanted to, like a Scandi grind all the way to the edge, that's fine. Well, it would take me an awful long time to get there because this has been formed with a secondary bevel. But if I wanted to do what I've just done with this one, I'd have to hold it at that angle, and that's a bit tricky because there's, and just have to go, well, just have to look at it, I guess. But equally, if you're trying to sharpen something that's got that on it, then you're going to need to use a sharpening stone, because obviously you can't get the convex edge with this. But what you can do, if you've got one of these, like my prangs for instance, have got this grind to them, I can still use those in this, and it again puts a tiny micro secondary bevel right on the tip. One other thing I wanted to mention, so this is not my knife. I've borrowed this one just to make a point here. Lots of knives, when you get them, particularly camping knives like this one, have a very hefty secondary bevel on them. So you've got the primary bevel that starts here going towards the edge, and then the secondary bevel starts here and slopes down. So it starts off straight, comes down towards the edge, and then it comes in like that. So because the geometry is like that, you can never get it that sharp, because that's all you've got to work with, this huge great secondary bevel. And I'm assuming that the manufacturers do that for durability, because although it doesn't get all that sharp, it's going to stay at the sharpness that you can attain with it because of the amount of material that's behind it. And that was how I found the Leatherman here to be. I basically took it to the sander and I sanded it out so that I made it much more of a convex edge, and then I put it through this system here and put a micro bevel on it. Now, one other point I wanted to make is that I've got a selection of steels here. So we've got carbon steel and stainless steel, like this knife here, and of course the Leatherman is all stainless. Generally speaking, you can get a much sharper edge on the carbon steels than you can stainless steel. That's not always the case. There are posh stainless steels, but this Leatherman isn't made out of that, and well, neither is this cheap kitchen knife. So that's sharpening at the 25-degree setting there. It's not going to be as sharp because I've not refined it to much of an edge, but sharp enough to slice through paper, so that's good enough. Now on this blade, it's got serrations. Now I screwed up the serrations years ago by trying to sharpen them on a bench grinder. But sharpening serrations is a feature of this little gadget. That's what this rod here is for. This is a diamond coated rod. And the idea is that you can sharpen in there. I don't know, you get it sharp eventually, I guess. What I've actually found is that since I started keeping my kitchen knives razor sharp, I use these for cutting bread, and it works loads better because you're not sawing through the loaf. Yes, you don't end up with a load of crumbs. It just cuts through the bread like it cuts through anything else. So let's have a quick look at sharpening blocks then, and I'm going to try and sharpen my little carving knife. So like I say, this one here has got a coarse side and a fine side. This here is the block that I use for sharpening chisels and planer blades, which we'll get into in another video. And this is very useful because it's dead flat and it's going to stay that way. This is a diamond block, and it's 400 grit there and 1000 grit there, in the same way that this sandpaper is 80 grit, for instance. So I'm going to start with 400. So what I'm looking at is the spine and how far the spine is off of the block, and then I'll just do the same on this side. And obviously I've got to roll it a bit to get to the tip. So what I'm doing now is making much more of a convex edge, but I am bringing it to an edge. usual recommendation for sharpening on a block is that you sharpen it until you feel a burr on one side, and a burr is when you've been pushing the material over and rolling it off the edge there. When you use the ceramic rods, you're not raising a burr at all, because you're just doing one edge, one side, and then the other side, and alternating between the two. So you don't have to raise a burr on it. I do when I'm using the machine, when I'm using the belt sander. But when I'm doing that, I'm actually profiling the blade. And that's not something you want to do on a on a block. You just want to get it sharp. Let's see what that's like. That's quite sharp. So I've got it to reasonably sharp on that side. I'll flip it over to the 1000 grit and finish it off. So I'm going to go for the same angle again. So what I've ended up doing with this is effectively ignoring the secondary micro bevel that would have been on there from the last time I sharpened it using that, and I've just continued that convex edge all the way down. So just to make sure it ends up in the right orientation, it would need stropping, which is what I'm doing here. There we go. Lastly, we'll have a look at this knife. So this is a Mora carving knife, and it's in rather poor condition. So this has been lent to me, and I've been asked if I'll sharpen it. So what's interesting about this knife is it's a Scandi grind. So there's no bevel at all, there's no secondary bevel at all, there's just a one primary bevel which starts here and comes right to the edge. It's also got the tip missing. But first of all, I'll clean the rust off, that'll be a good start. So just a bit of Scotch Brite. The tip then will be the first thing. That's the tip reformed then. So you can probably appreciate it's going to take a while to get an edge on this, because I've got to sharpen the whole of that bevel, not just the tiny bit near the edge like I'm doing with this one, or even when I'm dragging it through here. That said, if it's sharp, if it's only just off being sharp, then it wouldn't take that long. This is very blunt. All I'm doing each time is just placing it down, rocking it onto that bevel, and then pulling it back. I've deliberately gone quite a bit on one side to raise a burr, so I can just show you that. Raise a burr on one side and then flip the knife over it and carry on until you raise a burr on the other side. As we go along as well, you can see that that primary bevel, the entire surface of that primary bevel has become shiny. So we'll now refine that edge by flipping over to the 1000 grit. Let's see how sharp it is. There we go. Well, there we go then. Hopefully I've shown you something useful, and more importantly demonstrated what's actually going on when you try and sharpen something. And hopefully too, with that knowledge, you'll be able to keep your own knives nice and sharp. So I'll just reiterate keeping something sharp is easy peasy. Bringing it up to that sharpness, if it's been neglected for a while, does take a bit of effort, as you've seen. Any questions, let me know. I'll do my best to answer them. And next on the sharpening series, I think we'll have a look at the chainsaw. But that's it for now. Cheers!